Welcome, everyone, to the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformations podcast. This podcast is celebrating the 30th anniversary of the publication of The Promise of Mediation, the book that really started the movement of transformative practice to conflict. For this episode, we welcome Tom Wahlrab, a fellow of the Institute, and Anja Bekink, the president of the Institute.
Hi, Tom.
Hi,
Nice
Anja.
to see you again.
Nice to see you again.
It's really good to have this opportunity to talk to each other about transformative mediation and the promise of mediation. But for people that listen to us, it might be nice to know who you are and who I am.
Sure.
Could you just introduce yourself?
Well, sure. Thank you. I'll start then. My name is Tom Wahlrab, and I'm from Dayton, Ohio. And at the time that the Promise was published, 30 or so years ago, I think, I was running a community mediation center. So that's enough to get started.
Okay.
Please introduce
and we know
yourself.
each other. We know each other from the board of the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation. And my name is Anja Bekink. I'm from the Netherlands. And I work as an independent interim manager, mediator, project manager, mostly in healthcare, in hospitals. So that's a bit of my background. And I'm really curious then, Tom, because you said 30 years ago when the book was published, The Promise of Mediation, you were working in this community center as a director. And how did you get to know the book then, or the transformative mediation?
Well, Anja, I'm really excited about telling my story, but when you say that you are in a medical setting, I'm just really, really curious about that. So I'm going to try to be real short and offer an overview without getting too serious about things, because I want to get to you. Okay?
That's fine.
All right. Well, I don't know if everybody knows, but 30 years ago or so, the prevailing mediation model was a 5-stage or 7-stage model. Mediation had gotten started, and it's in the Promise, this story. Community mediation got started in the 70s and in neighborhoods. But by the time the 80s rolled around, the 90s rolled around, the justice system and the courts had kind of like co-opted everything and transformed, I don't want to use that word, remade mediation from a neighborhood thing where people could get together and help each other and support each other in figuring out issues, to something that looked very much like a justice system. So it was highly authoritative, highly directive, and that's what most of us back then got trained in. We were managing the process for any mediation that we had, and by the time Promise was published, I had been running a community mediation center for a while, and I was getting less and less comfortable with teaching the idea that it's the participants that make decisions about what they want to do. Yet I knew I was making all kinds of decisions as a mediator. It's like, hey, there was something wrong with this. I was like lying to the people I was teaching to, but I didn't know what to do about it. So we kept trying to adjust things and change our manual and stuff. And then the Promise came out. And all of a sudden, we read it, and we didn't know how to change what we were doing, but we knew what we were. Here, somewhere in this book, there's an answer. Okay, and we were really lucky because Joe Folger showed up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is just down the road from us. He taught some basic classes at Antioch College, which is just a few miles from us also. So we got to meet him and know him, and the rest is history. So I was in a community mediation center. We were doing a model that wasn't congruent with the way we thought and believed. We had to build trust with the police department, the prosecutors, and the neighborhood associations, all these various organizations. And here we were practicing very much like what they were doing in these organizations. And it's like, if this is the alternative, what's our value here? And it wasn't until the Promise came along that we realized what our value was. Okay, so without going into a whole lot of detail, I'm gonna.
No, but that Tom is a great story, and it's a bit like mine. I was working, as I said, in healthcare as an interim manager, and when you work in hospitals as an interim manager, you you get to work in departments where there might be issues between people, that the cooperation is not flowing fluently, people are having conflicts, etc. And I got really interested in what could I do as a manager to help people to talk to each other about their conflicts. And then the thing that came to mind was, I need to do mediation and mediation course. So I did. But the mediation course I took was like the same that you said, the facilitative one, where as a mediator, you learned all these steps and you learned how to control the process and I did my exams and that went well. But then I didn't do anything with it. And then I decided to become a member of this Dutch Association of Mediators in Healthcare to meet other mediators and hear their experience and their stories. And this association every year organized a 2-day training. And I thought, okay, I'll join this training because then I'll meet this other mediators. And then I didn't even look at the subject of the training because I wasn't interested in that. I was merely interested in meeting other mediators, whatever the course was. And then it turns out to be about transformative mediation with Carol Bloom. So
Carol Bloom, okay. Yeah, I know her.
And and I was sitting in this training and suddenly I thought, I understand this. This feels okay. This feels really comfortable. This feels like it should be. I don't have to remember all these faces. I can just, it feels more natural. I think that is what it meant to me. And the funny thing was, there were two funny things. After training, when I was driving home, I thought, okay, I'm going to practice this. I'm going to phone a friend of mine, and I knew she had some troubles at work. And I will start this conversation by using the instruments from TM, like the reflection and the summary and listening. So I did. And she was talking and talking. And then after, say, 20 minutes, I changed it and I started asking a lot of questions to her. And then after the conversation, after about an hour, I said to her, what did you notice about this conversation? And she literally said to me, the first part of the conversation was great because I could think and all these ideas came up in my mind and my thoughts were exploring. And then the second part, my brain was shut down by all the questions you asked. And I was, whoa, this is really impressive.
Yeah.
So that was
I just talked over you. I'm sorry. Repeat what you said. Nobody heard you because I was
following the parties, Tom. That's what we do. So no, but that was for me. It was like something. Oh wow, this is really impressive. And then the funny thing is, because after I did the mediation training, I think about a year ago, I had the facilitative one, and I never did a mediation. And 2 days after the training in TM, I got this phone call if I wanted to do a mediation. And I was, this is sort of miracle or something. Out of the blue, this question came. And then I decided, okay, if I'm now starting doing mediations, I might as well do it on the transformative basis and forget about the facilitative way of doing mediation. So that's when I started working as a transformative mediation. So it was coincidence. I never read the book by then. It was mentioned in the training, but that was not what I read. And I think it's in the States, it's probably more convenient that you read the book or you get into the book. In Holland, the book is not very famous. Okay, if you do the mediation training, there is a book about all kinds of mediation, and there's also a chapter about transformative mediation, but that was all that I knew about it. And I think even in my training as a mediator, I really didn't notice it. It was not at that point. It was not, how do you say it? It didn't catch my eye. But after the training, I was like, okay. So that's how I met transformative mediation. And after that, because I got really interested in it, then I took some more training. I went to Italy where Joe was giving a training in transformative, the basic training in transformative mediation. And I met up with Joe a couple of more times when he was in Europe, in Denmark, in Germany, just because I really wanted to learn from him because he's really, it's it's what you said. It's a pleasure, and it's not only pleasure, but he practiced what he preaches. He is transformative mediation, and I learned a lot from him. So,
Yeah, he's a professor, so he's used to talking and teaching and writing and thinking,
yeah,
and we really need people like that to list theorize and come up with new ideas. And the issue of how, or the history of how mediation moved from neighborhood centers to court systems, at least in this country, and that they, as you talk about being in different cultures, you can go to Italy and learn a different culture, and in mediation, once they showed up in court system, it really transformed I don't want to use that word, it changed the way people were mediating, and I don't think people noticed it necessarily. I'm sure others did, but Joe and Baruch are the ones that actually, looked at and read what the incongruencies from the idea of it to what it had become, and just offered something else. And like you said, this kind of fit better. This is the way this felt better for me. It was the same for me, and I'm sure it's other people. This just fit better with my personality. I'm kind of a supportive person. I don't want to tell people what to do. I'm not sure that I can do that very well.
But I think a lot of people get trained to do it. I'm a manager, and as a manager, the feeling is that you should tell people what to do, control the process. But not only because of transformative mediation, but it had a large part in it. It changed also my work as a manager, having much more faith in capacities of other people and being more able to let go and not having the feeling that I had to solve all the problems, but that we could do it together and that people are really capable, even if it doesn't look like that, to sort out things and to think what they would like to do and what's important for them, and to get back into connection with other people. And I had some really some experiences that were sort of now I'm looking for the word in English, but they made such a big impression on me that I still get goosebumps if I think about it. And that people what impresses me most is that people come up with things that I, as mediator, never could have thought that they would come up with. If they'd ask me what the solution could be, I would come up with a range of solutions, but they come up with solutions that I wouldn't be able to imagine that they come up with.
Well, I remember reading other authors about mediation, and they often said that 90% of the time the solution is, and they would offer you a solution. And I think I vaguely remember that experience also. Well, I know exactly what, 5 minutes in, I know exactly what they need to get to.
Yeah. And I really remember Joe said, well, if it was so easy, then people would have thought it themselves. So don't be so arrogant that you think that they can't think of these solutions if they're so easy. So that means that it isn't easy. And I think as a mediator, it's a really worthwhile experience to be in conflict yourself, to feel what it does for you to be in a conflict, and not that you should create conflicts all day and be in it, but by by getting to know transformative mediation and the theory behind it, I get to know myself better. I can better understand and see for myself when, for instance, my communication is changing, when I'm not strong anymore, but I communicate more from a point of weakness, and to feel that better in myself. I think, okay, you're going down the drain, and then you're not always able to then make a decision if you can get back to constructive communication, but at least by being aware of yourself, you have a better choice.
and the further down the drain you go, the further the less you're able to actually see that you're going down the drain,
Yeah,
and hence you need help. You
yeah.
know.
I had this, that was also, no, not just after training. It was a bit further on when we had the conference in the States a couple of years, and there was the request to write a chapter for a book about your own experience with the transformative model.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I had this little story when I went with my husband. We had to go to a party, and in the neighborhood where I live, there is this bridge, and only one car can cross the bridge at a time. You know, so, and it was always there that people tried to get over the bridge first, so to block the other person. And we went to the bridge and we were in a bit of a hurry, and my husband drove on the bridge, and then the other car from the opposite side, who had the right to go first, started driving really fast and blocked us on the bridge. And my husband was fuming, and there were just two guys, one behind the steering wheel, one next to him, and another guy, I think, in the back or something. And my husband was fuming because he said, they're doing this on purpose and I'm not going back. And I was thinking, okay, you know, and I started to get angry as well. And then I thought about the model and thought, okay, I have a choice now. I can be really angry and we stay on this bridge and we really have this confrontation. Or what would I do if it was my best friend on the other side in the other car? And I thought I would just ask him for help. So I went out the car and I saw my husband looking at me and thinking, what is she going to do now? I went to the other car, they turned down their window and I said, you know, I know that you have the first right to pass the bridge, but we're on the bridge already. We didn't see you and it's really hard now to get back. Would you mind to let us through? Can you help me? And they were silent for a couple of seconds. And then this guy said, of course we can help you. And he drove back his car. We could cross the bridge and it was done. You know, and I meant it, you know, because I think you can't fake this because then people won't believe you. But if you really can put your mind again in a strong, you know, in a constructive setting, then people see that you mean it. And I was really, you know, touched by that. That I thought, okay, you know, why should you be angry or create a fight if you can just communicate or say things as you should do it normally in a difficult situation? No, it is. And what I said about the impressiveness of people and what solutions they think of, I have this was this one mediation that I still think of all the time. I was also, apart from working in hospitals, I was also working as a neighborhood mediator, like a volunteer neighborhood mediator in the city where I lived. And there was this mediation in one of the parts of the city. An organization opened a house for youngsters with difficulties in behavior. So they were like 18 plus, but there were problems with their behavior. And they didn't tell the people that lived around it. And mostly the people that lived around it were families with young children. And then this organization opened, and I think about 15 or 20 youngsters lived there. And they did what youngsters do, and especially maybe ones that have problems. They use drugs, they make noise. So there were, how do you call them, sirings in the park. There was pizza ordering the whole night. There were people coming, friends coming and making noise. So the neighbors were really upset and they were really worried as well about the health of their children who were playing around that house in the park and on the street. So we first had a meeting with, I think, about 20 neighbors and some people from the house, not the people that live there, but the people that work there. And people were screaming and you know, and coming up with all these things they were angry about. And then the end of the meeting, after an hour, they arranged a small committee from neighbors and people that worked at the house to come up with some solutions. So they did, and they said, okay, we'll have another meeting in a couple of weeks with the small committee to talk about what we did and if anything more is needed. So we went to this small meeting. Oh, the police was involved as well. There were 2 neighborhood policemen at the second meeting as well, some neighbors and some people from the house. And they did have this really constructive conversation about the things they came up with, how they should communicate, how they would find each other, etc., etc. But there was one neighbor, a woman, and she lived close next to this organization, to these houses, and she was like really bitchy all the time, you know. And by the end of the meeting, I said, you know, did you talk about everything, or is there another subject that hasn't been on the table yet and you'd like to talk about it? And then this neighbor said, yes, there's something I want to say. And I was in myself saying, oh no, not her again. You know, I, I almost stopped her, but I didn't do so. And then she said, and that really touched me, she said, you know, it's almost spring, and wouldn't be a great idea if we planned today that we would all work together in our gardens, the people that live in this organization and the neighbors, and work together to make our gardens really beautiful, ready for the spring. And I was like, you know, I was so embarrassed of myself
Yeah.
and the thoughts that I had about this woman, and that I never ever expected that she would come up with something like that. So every time now I'm in a mediation and I have negative thoughts about somebody, I think back to this woman and think, Anja, stop. You know, people have
Yeah.
what it's they have what's needed. They can do this. And it's I learned a lot from that about myself.
Can I share a story?
Yeah, please.
Um, I don't know if this is the best one or not, but the I talked about getting referrals from police officers and police departments, and when they see people, these people are at their worst. And in this model, we talk about they're weak and self-absorbed, but they look like they're angry. They're ready to go off on the deep end. They're ready to do harm often. This is what, when the police are called, this is what they see all the time. And they had been back to this house, half a dozen times or more. And each time the event that was taking place at this house, there were more and more people. So the people living in the house, they were having problems with somebody next door. Not sure what the problem was, but they would call up their friends and relatives each time it happened. So each time it happened, there were more people, and it was getting to be 20, 30 people. It was like a big riot going on in front of this house. And you know, whenever they came, everybody would scatter. There's no laws broken. So eventually they referred to the mediation center, and I went over and I went into each house and I invited them to come down to the mediation center, and nobody came. It's like we scheduled it, we were ready for them, but nobody came. So I went back to them, and you know, I just sat with the people in each house. In one house, there were just a woman and a dog. In another house, there was just all kinds of people. And it was just a real strange environment, without going into details. Eventually, what the house with all the people decided was they were going to have the matriarch come to a mediation. And the only place they would mediate was the empty lot next door at the picnic table. And so I went to the other house where the woman with the dog, and it was a scary dog. I mean, I had to knock on the door, and this dog went nuts, and I had to walk in with that dog. Eventually, this woman agreed that she would come out. So eventually, you know, after lots of hours and lots of money spent with the police intervening and seeing these people at their worst, I sat down in an empty lot at a picnic table with two women, and they just had a normal conversation.
Yeah.
And they had talked about how they met each other and how they liked each other when they met each other. And they weren't sure what happened to make it so awful between each other, but they just renewed their friendship and made an agreement that they would, without going into details, but they got some clarity about who they were to each other, and said, this is just a mess. Let's not do this anymore. And so the woman with all the people, she just said the word.
Yeah.
You know, you talk about cultures,
yeah.
you know, a matriarchal culture, apparently, because she had influence over all these people. No more violence. The police were never called out again.
Yeah, but I think Tom, you know, what you gave them is the opportunity to have a normal conversation instead of
Yeah.
telling them what to do, you know. And I find with a lot of mediators, you know, who are trained in the facilitative model, they're afraid of conflict. So they try to keep everything calm and down and reframe it and look at the positive side of it, you know. And I think, you know, when you're really in a conflict, you're just angry. And, you know, you can't say to people, you have to be constructive. You can't be angry when you're angry. And
Right.
if I was really angry and you would tell me to be polite and listen to the other person, and, you know, I think I get even more angry. It wouldn't help me. So that's what I like about the transformative model, that, like Joe says, that, you know, go for the heat, because where the heat is the conflict.
Yeah.
The conflict is not in the things that people agree on. You know, it's in the things that they differ, that they have different opinions about or different views.
Yeah, I think that the premise or this theory and the practice has allowed us to open up the conflict and help people manage how they interact with each
Yeah.
other. And you know, as we've been trained, and the listeners probably have been trained in this model, so they know what I'm saying. But I don't think the police or the judges or the court bailiffs or the prosecutor want to see all this messy conflict open up,
Oh,
because
yeah,
in fact they don't know what to do with it.
exactly.
And maybe go ahead.
Yeah. No, exactly, but exactly what you say, Tom. Sorry for interrupting you, but they don't know what to do with it. And if you don't know what to do with it, that doesn't feel comfortable. And I have to admit, I had to get used to that as well. This one of the first mediations I did, you know, I think I was more nervous than the people in the mediation. And halfway through the mediation, I lost it and I completely started controlling the process and doing all these kinds of things that I shouldn't do as a transformative mediator. But that was not because of the parties did their thing, but that was because I was afraid of conflict, and I was
Yeah,
afraid of not knowing how it would end. And I think you need, if you want to practice transformative mediation, the first thing is is to get confidence, not only in parties, you know, but also in yourself, that you're able to let go.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that is at the start, that is hard if you don't have a lot of experience and you feel responsible as a mediator, huh? Because you're hired, they pay you, you know. So it feels a bit not natural to let the conflict maybe even first get deeper and get more violent, or how you want to call it. You know, the natural person or the natural way of doing things, maybe to calm it down and say, listen, what do you like about her whatsoever. But you know, I haven't been in a lot of conflicts myself, luckily, but I have been in some conflicts that were really um that really were painful for me. And then, you know, it's not, if then somebody says to you, okay, be polite and listen, whatever, when you really feel hurt or really feel, you know, it's not possible.
That's right. Not possible.
It's not possible. You're so angry, and you need to have the possibility to let it go, you know, to talk about it. And I think if you don't do that, if the steam has no opportunity to get released, then your brain is too full with steam to think about constructive things and solutions or whatsoever.
Yeah, the reflections in the summers are really powerful because
Yeah,
they allow that person to stop babbling on or screaming on and hear what they've had to say.
yeah. And I
Well,
really like this exercise when we do training, you know, we have this listening exercise that you say to two people, okay, one of you talks about something that's important to you, and the other person listens, only listens, you know, not asking questions, not giving any remarks, not doing, you know, even not using the reflections or the summary, just listen. And then you change. And then most of the time, the experience for most people is if you ask them, how was it to be listened to? That a lot of people say, it was great. There was nobody interrupting my thoughts. I came to thoughts that never came up to me, so that they really enjoy it. And that the people that were listening, they are the ones that that find it more difficult because they have the urge or they feel that they need to do something. And they don't realize that by just listening, you do a lot. And, so I always think that's a good experience because a lot of time we're not good listeners. A lot of people are not good listeners. Yeah.
And having the experience of that exercise, so you come up with one of your own issues and actually experience being listened to.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
It is. It's very, very powerful. And not then being asked questions or, and I think then when you only do the listening, okay, that's not what we do. We use our reflections and summary. But when only listening in itself is already powerful. And then when you do reflections, it's even more powerful. You don't need questions to help people to form their thoughts, to get to know what they're thinking about. The reflection is really, really strong.
And those questions, you had that experience with your friend who you listened
Yeah.
for a while, then you
Yeah.
started asking questions, and what happened to her? Yeah, messed her up good.
But also what happened to me, Tom, when I started thinking about what questions do I need to ask, I wasn't able to listen to her because I was busy with thinking of questions I should ask.
Well, speaking of questions, I have a question.
Okay.
And I apologize for having thought about this question while you were talking.
Oh, it's okay.
Thank you. Thank you for forgiving me.
Let's get into a fight.
So, the promise came into our lives, or the theory, the practice came into our lives, and we've been practicing it in our communities. And you mentioned your community, your city as a volunteer mediator, and also, but your work, in the hospital, in your medical setting. Maybe the question, and I don't know if this is the best question, or you can change it any way you want, but how has us practicing this model in our environments changed or affected our environment? I want to try to answer the question myself, but I'm also, is that a good question for you? Do you think you could talk about your hospital and say, I think this is what it's done? And, without any research necessarily, and maybe I can go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think, by using the model, understanding the model and doing mediations, I became a much better listener. So also as a manager, I became a better listener. And I use the instruments in a lot of situations. For instance, in a meeting when there's not a conflict, I use a lot of, when we go through different agenda points, I use reflections and summaries. And I've got the feeling that summaries, for instance, really help people to get more out of a meeting because it's more clearer what they decided on or what they talked about. And also, following the parties, if we've got the agenda and I've got the feeling that there's a lot of energy, say on the third or fourth agenda point, I always, ask people to say, okay, would you like to start with the first point, or do you prefer to start with another agenda point? And then I leave it up to them. And then sometimes they say, okay, no, yeah, well, really, we'd like to talk about point 4 first. And I think, okay, I'll leave decisions more open to them. And what I get back, because I do different assignments, and what I get back, the funny thing is I get a lot of time hired when I'm not an interim manager, for instance, for projects, when there are a lot of people with a lot of different interests involved. And I think that I learned by TM to really help them to have conversations about this different interest and to listen to each other. So in that way, I hope to be a better manager or leader of a meeting or whatsoever. So I think that is that what you meant by your question?
I think so. So it's not only actual third-party intervention mediator role, the skills, the theory, the practice, the principles are being implied in many different settings.
Yes.
And what you're noticing is that your fellow employees or the other people you're working with, they're actually noticing and they're finding their own agency to respond and tell you what they want, how they want to reorganize the meeting or change the agenda. And they seem like you are modeling listening, you're modeling reflections, and they're doing the same thing. They're picking up on it and doing it themselves.
Yeah, and that's why I think that using the model and the instruments also is a great way to prevent conflicts. You know, so to because sometimes I think, you know, by the time you get to the mediator, the conflict has been so high that a lot of people have been hurt. You know, it's a horrible experience to be in a bad conflict. And I think if you can use the instruments and the model and the theory in other settings when there's not a conflict, a lot of time you can prevent people from getting into this conflict.
So I wonder if I could take a stab at trying to evaluate the effect on City of Dayton.
Yeah.
And this is just me talking, okay? I can't prove anything.
No.
I have an example or two, which I'm not sure if they're good examples. But anyway, when we started out back in 1988, and by the time I acted as a volunteer for 5 years before I started directing the center itself. But we were doing, you know, 50 to 100 mediations a year. It wasn't a whole lot. And within a few years, especially after we began transformative process using that model, we're doing hundreds, 500-700 mediations a year, and involving 2,000 to 3,000 people a year. And this is a community of 500,000.
Yeah.
So after 30 years, we can assume that somewhere between 15 and 30% of the people in this community have actually come down to the center and sat down and talked about their issues.
Yeah. Wow.
And also, it's the police and all the municipal court systems are using us. You know, they realize it's a true alternative. And even if the people in the mediation don't get to an agreement, when they go to their court date, in fact, half of their issues are gone, and this is all they want to work on, or this is what they want.
And they have more clarity they have more clarity probably when they go to court, what's important to them and what not, and you know.
So within the last 10 years or so, we had an incident, more than an incident, but a Black man died while in police custody. And we know that we've had a lot of demonstrations. Black Lives Matter came out of Black men dying while in police custody. And in Dayton, it happened. And we had people that were demonstrating and coming to the commission meetings. And in fact, it was getting violent in our community. And we did call people together. Can we talk about this? And we had community conversations involving anywhere from 20 to 40 people. And we had a dozen mediations involving individuals and organizations and all elected officials. At least a dozen mediations where they came together and talked and tried to figure out what they could do and how they could do things different and make promises. And I don't think that would have happened if they hadn't trusted, you know, what the Mediation Center was offering them. And the people were accustomed. Many people that were involved in these conversations, they knew about the Mediation Center or they knew people who had been involved in mediations. So my contention, my judgment is that you know, if we had been, you know, designing solutions for people just like the police and the courts, we wouldn't have had that willingness of the people to come together. They knew when they came to the table, when they came into the room, when they started that conversation, that they would be heard.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's my position. that's what I believe.
But that's really yeah, but I think that is what you say. That's where it is. What is the really, the value of the model and the way we practice it? People feel heard, and they feel that they have the possibility to say what they have on their mind without being judged about the way they say it. And by helping them with reflections, they are able to look in the mirror and to think, what I just said is maybe not
Yeah.
how I should say it.
Yeah.
But
To
if
listen
you
to
would
yourself.
tell them, yeah, but if you would tell them to calm down, it wouldn't have been their own decision and their own conclusion. And I feel that is a sort of patronizing. You being the mediator up there telling the parties how they should behave, as it is really easy to be in a conflict. I think it's one of the hardest things to be in a conflict. And yeah, yeah.
So Anja, we probably should wrap up time-wise, and I'm just going to
Yeah,
offer.
because we can talk on for hours, Tom.
We could,
And I really always love talking to you, and especially when we talk about the model. So, is there something that you want to say to end this conversation, to wrap it up? A
well,
giveaway message or
you and I got to know each other on the Institute board.
Mhm.
So, our members know we have membership, we have boards, or we have a board, we have the fellows. But you and I met on the board, and at the time I was probably the VP or the president. I'm not sure which. But you stepped forward and said, "I'm willing to play a role here."
Mhm.
And we got to know each other, and you became the VP. And shortly thereafter, I resigned, or my time was up as the president, and I've stayed around. And
Mhm.
you've been the president for a number of years now, and we've gotten to know each other that way. So not, we haven't mediated together, we haven't seen each other, but you came to Dayton, and I probably saw you, but we don't remember meeting each other
No.
in Dayton. So we've just known each other, and I
Yeah.
don't know what that's got to do with the model, but the opportunity to have a role that's
Mhm.
so informed and so powerful, as from our experience,
Mhm.
that's how we met each other, and that's how we've supported each other in these responsible roles on the board. And I
Mhm.
just really cherish I just love it that Joe came to Dayton, and of course Baruch did too, and a few others. But we got to learn this, and we got to use it in our own way, figure out how it made sense in my community, and how it makes sense in your environment, in your community. It's really, I'm just really, really grateful for the Promise, for Joe and Baruch, and the
Yeah.
Institute folks, and for you. I mean,
Mhm.
25 years later, I got to meet you, and we got to hang out together.
Yeah,
And
and now we
and
even
and
do a podcast
now
together.
we get to do a podcast. So all the listeners, it's great. It's
Yeah.
not
Oh,
kumbaya,
no,
but
it
it's
is.
serious, meaningful
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. No, it is, Tom, and it's been a pleasure to meet you on the board and still to have this to be able to have this conversation. So it's always inspiring and you learn from it. And yeah, I hope that we have many more inspiring conversations in the future.
And I hope we just a little bit inspired others.
Yes, I do so. And if not, their loss.
They're lost, and we had fun. All right.
Oh,
Thank you,
thanks,
Anja.
Tom. Okay.